So can I welcome you all along to what I hope will be a fairly quick briefing on the review of the National Partnership Agreement on Legal Assistance Services. It's James here from Community Legal Centres Queensland. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and on which we work across Queensland. Acknowledge that this is and always was Aboriginal land. The purpose of this session, as I say, is to just give a bit of an overview about the NPA review, what it is that we're talking about, some of the context for it, and some of the different ways that you can be involved. I'm hoping to speak for no more than about 15 or 20 minutes. That's kind of in terms of the content that I've prepared, but I'm really keen for you to get involved in this as a conversation and to clarify any outstanding queries that you've got. There are a couple of ways that you can ask questions. One is to press that button that looks like a hand on the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll see your hand go up. I'll be able to unmute your microphone and you'll be able to ask a question that way. The other way that you can ask a question is to type into the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. As I say, I think I'm going to try and get through the content fairly quickly, so I will encourage you to ask questions as we go, which isn't always the best way for these webinars to run, but I think given that it's a relatively small group and a pretty focused conversation, that it should go okay. So in terms of setting the context, I want to talk a little bit about how things worked before the National Partnership Agreement on Legal Assistance Services came into effect. I'm going to call it the NPA through the course of the presentation, as you'll see on the slides. How, from our perspective here at Community Legal Centres Queensland, we think the NPA has changed the way that funding is administered and services are provided for our member community legal centres. Talk a little bit about the process for the review of the NPA and provide some information about ways that you can get involved in the review. So the National Partnership Agreement came into effect on 1 July 2015. Before that, community legal centres in Queensland were funded in funding agreements that were tripartite agreements, and that's what the image on the right is trying to show. Both the Queensland Government and the Commonwealth Government made independent decisions about the level of funding that would be provided to individual community legal centres, provided that information to them in each of those contracts, and it was executed as a tripartite contract between the Attorney General's Department at the Commonwealth level and Legal Aid. Funding was provided under what was called the CLSP, the Community Legal Services Program, and at a Commonwealth level. That program included a number of specialist sub-programs. So there were about 14 different pots of money that had been earmarked for particular types of services to be provided by individual community legal centres. The funding mix at that time was about 60% Queensland funding and about 40% Commonwealth funding. The lion's share of the Queensland funding came from the interest on lawyers' trust accounts. We call it here the LIPTAF, the Legal Practitioners Interest on Trust Accounts Fund. Of the about 60% of funding that came to community legal centres from the Queensland Government, over 50% of the total, which is over 80% of the Queensland component, came from the interest on lawyers' trust accounts. In 2012, the Queensland Government reviewed how that funding was administered and the services to which it was being provided, and a pretty substantial tranche of changes came through then. There was the establishment of a specialist unit within the Department of Justice, at the time the Legal Assistance Strategy and Funding. And it meant that the Queensland Government, at an officer level within the Department of Justice and Attorney General, took a more hands-on role in terms of managing our funding program in its relationships with individual CLCs and with the sector collectively, and meant that Legal Aid Queensland, which had a bit more of a hands-on role in setting some of the policy and funding settings for us, its role became essentially program management or contract management, and a lot of the strategy and policy work was happening within the department. While all of that was going on, there was a national partnership agreement on legal assistance services, but that agreement, which ran from 2010 to 2015, only really set the priorities for the work of legal aid commissions in each of the 8 jurisdictions. Community legal centres weren't affected by that, other than the National Partnership Agreement nudged legal aid commissions in different parts of the country to undertake different types of service delivery and different types of service models, often adopting or adapting the work that community legal centres had been doing for a long period of time. That National Partnership Agreement was reviewed in 2014 and made a number of suggestions, including that the National Partnership Agreement or more closely align with the work that community legal centres are doing, and in part that contributed to our current National Partnership Agreement. I think it's important when we're having a conversation about the NPA and reviewing the NPA to think about what life was like before the NPA came along, and particularly before the LIPTAF review happened. Community legal centres in Queensland had very short-term and quite unsatisfactory funding arrangements, so often 12-month funding agreements kind of rolling over. There was no real clarity around how government decision-making was made in that work. The role of Legal Aid Queensland was a little bit unclear in terms of the extent to which governments were receiving advice about how funding ought to be distributed and how funding would be managed. So I think a number of the changes that have happened, particularly since the LIPTAF review, but also since the NPA came in, have broadly been positive, and I think it'll be really important for us not to lose sight of that as we're engaging in this NPA review. So after the NPA came along, as I said, it came into effect from 1 July 2015 and devolved responsibility, so the Commonwealth was no longer making decisions about the individual recipients of Commonwealth funding for CLCs in a general sense. So it expected to provide essentially a pot of funding to state or territory governments, and those state or territory governments could run whatever process they liked, essentially, to distribute that funding to community legal centres in their jurisdiction. There's a qualification on that at the time the National Partnership Agreement came in, there were a number of centres who had received additional funding from the previous government under the watchful eye of then Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, and those centres, or the funding that was allocated for each of those centres, was expected to continue for the first 2 years of the National Partnership Agreement. But other than that list of centres, the majority of the funding was provided to the Queensland Government to make decisions on allocation to individual CLCs. As a result of it being kind of handed over as a pot of money to the Queensland Department, what were formerly the sub-programs under the CLSP were collapsed, and so some of those programs like that, some examples there are things like the Child Support Program or the Welfare Rights Program or the Rural Women's Outreach Program were no longer a requirement with a specific amount of funding tagged to them, while the number of centres that were doing that work previously continued doing that work. It was no longer a condition of their funding and no longer part of a sub-program. In handing over responsibility to the Queensland Government, that also handed over a number of program support functions to individual states and territories. That included the decommissioning of class, and I'll speak about that a little bit more later on. Things like organising to have telephone interpreters available and making sure that there was adequate funding retained in some of those program support services. As a result of this kind of process, and consistent with moves that have been in hand moves that have been started to be taken since the LIPTAF review, there was more and more of a movement towards a procurement process here in Queensland. So applications and allocations is kind of the way that the Queensland government talks about it. We probably call it a tendering process. And we've seen those kind of processes used a lot over the last 5 or 6 years in allocating funding to community legal centres. In fact, we've had one of those processes every year under the National Partnership Agreement, a national partnership agreement that ostensibly was going to provide more long-term and certain funding for the sector. That's one construction that we would put on it is that having those kind of processes happening as often as they do demonstrates that the sector hasn't actually received the long-term sustainable commitment to funding that it's looking for. Another implication of the introduction of the NPA and related to, I guess, the two previous points was that there was a reduced role, particularly for the Attorney General's Department, which formerly had a program management function, but has devolved a lot of that responsibility to state and territory governments. It's also because they've done less of that work, then the engagement of NACLAC in some of that kind of program liaison work hasn't been as strong, and so they've evolved to providing more and more support to state and territory CLC peaks, individual centres to do that kind of advocacy, to support that kind of advocacy to state and territory governments. Might just pause there and see if anyone's got any questions. A reminder, you can type a question into the questions box, or you can press that button that looks like a hand, and I can unmute your microphone. Okay, I'll move on. The National Partnership Agreement includes a table that shows the dollar amount going to each state and territory for each of the 5 years of the National Partnership Agreement for each of the Legal Aid Commission and the pool of funding for community legal centres. When the NPA was signed, that table clearly showed that there would be a significant drop in the amount of funding provided to community legal centres, in the order of 30%. And many of you will be aware of the work that we all had to do to try and get that funding reinstated through a nationally coordinated campaign of Fund Equal Justice. In April of last year, that funding was reinstated. We were expecting the funding cut in June. The announcement was made in April, so there was a bit of a scramble to get things organised. In order for that funding to be reinstated, there was a variation to the National Partnership Agreement that included the amount being reinstated, but clarifying that it could only be used for defined purposes, or was classed as defined funding, and essentially it was a focus on family law and family violence related work in community legal centres. The other thing to note around kind of quantum of funding and how that's been represented in the NPA is that although the NPA was established to be the core infrastructure through which Commonwealth funding would pass to the states and territories for legal assistance services, there have been a few examples where the Commonwealth has made a decision to invest in new programs, and they've done that outside of the NPA. Women's Safety Package, I've called WSP on the slide there, is an example of that. There have now been 3 tranches of funding come through the Women's Safety Package in direct contracts from Attorney Generals to a couple of community legal centres here in Queensland, and we'll see something similar, I expect, with the funding that's been tagged for elder abuse related services that was announced in the May budget. So while the NPA has provided in some cases a pretty sound infrastructure or mechanism by which the Commonwealth provides funding to the state to support legal assistance services, it's been patchy, and there are a couple of examples that we can point to there in terms of things like the funding cliff, working outside that, where it's probably not lived up to the promise of of consistent, certain funding allocated in a relatively transparent way, which is supported by a local Queensland evidence base and Queensland collaborative planning. Which brings me to the point of collaborative planning. As we'll see in a little while, one of the areas of exploration under the National Partnership Agreement is how successfully or not collaborative planning has worked. Here in Queensland at a statewide level, my sense is we're probably doing it as well as anyone in the country. I think there are a few reasons for that. One is the LIPTAF review had already suggested that there was more work to do in that space, and that forums like QLAF should be used to help support some of that high-level collaborative planning, including providing advice to government about services. Prior to the NPA, but after the LIPTAF review, community legal centres had gotten together and developed their own legal service plan, and that had, while that document has been superseded by collaborative planning in a lot of ways, I think that meant that we had a clear sense in the sector about the types of things that we wanted, where we wanted closer collaboration, whether that was more training, better referrals, better partnerships, new or increased services. A lot of that work had been done, and so we were able to have a clear sense of what our mandate was when engaging in those different conversations. Collaborative planning has happened at the QLAF level, and there's some resources on the QLAF website that show program plans and talk about some of the working groups that were formed to support that work. And I think that, as I say, is progressing pretty well, and in Queensland we do it relatively well. We've also been provided with some resources to support regional service planning, because we don't just want a Brisbane-based or top-down approach to collaborative planning. We think it's important that there's also processes at working with frontline services to support their planning and better understand the needs of their communities. We're piloting some of that work at the moment, and again, I think we're doing pretty well in that space relative perhaps to other states and territories. I'll flag New South Wales has been doing collaborative legal service delivery for a long period of time, and that's a pretty good model too. But I think the regional service planning approach that we're taking has the potential to support statewide collaborative planning. One of the other things that will come up in the context of the NPA review is around data and reporting. It's not the sexiest aspect of what's going on in CLCs, but I think is an important one, and it has been affected by and affects how well the NPA is working. So a couple of key changes were the decommissioning of CLCs by the Attorney General's Department, and NACLAC being provided with wholly insufficient funds to develop a new national database class that's rolled out with some challenges. A transition to a new data standards manual, which is quite separate to a new database. So describing and articulating what the data standards say isn't the same thing as a database that captures it. There's been a bit of crossover there. The implementation of that new data standards manual, which was intended to have a common set of rules across all legal assistance providers, so ATSLs, legal aid, CLCs, family violence prevention legal services, but kind of just having that thrust upon us has proven to be a little bit tricky in terms of a lack of consistency. What we're shooting for is, to the best of our ability, nationally consistent data, but for a number of reasons that has been difficult. And practically, I think that's played out for CLCs in Queensland. We've had to renegotiate the types and numbers of services that they provide under their funding agreements, because the way that the data is described and measured has changed. And so that has presented a few teething problems as well, I think. And these are things that you might want to raise in the context of the NPA review. So the review itself, terms of reference were agreed by 9 attorneys general, so the Commonwealth and each of the state and territories. That information I've circulated previously, but I will again at the end of this presentation. Pretty high level, and as you can see on the right, the consultants have taken those terms of reference and boiled them down into the 6 areas for exploration that are there. The terms of reference were developed. An external consultant was commissioned to undertake the review. That is a firm called Urbis, with whom we've not worked in the past, but I think our experience so far has been pretty positive. They've developed a review plan. That review plan is not a publicly available document in the sense that it's not published on their website or anything, but we have a copy of that, and I'm happy to share that. I'll circulate that to this group by email after the presentation as well. That kind of goes through the timeline of how the review is going to work, areas of focus for the reviewers, and goes down to a level of kind of an interview guide for some of the conversations that they'll have. So it's a pretty useful document that they've shared with the sector. Last week, Urbis released a discussion paper which has 18 questions across those 6 areas of exploration, areas for exploration, and that is the basis on which interested stakeholders, including CLCs, can contribute. My sense is that they're pretty keen to get a lot of information through written submissions and written responses to that discussion paper. There's a website, larsubmissions.com.au. It's LAR for Legal Assistance Review, submissions.com.au, where the discussion paper is and a template for responding to the discussion paper and other information from Urbis. They recognise that they're not going to be able to speak to everyone who would like to speak to them, although there are ways that people can get involved in conversations, and see the submission piece as an important one. So we'd encourage you to make short written submissions to the NPA review, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that will work later. You'll see in terms of those areas for exploration, the questions around how efficient and effective legal services are delivered under the NPA. We'll come back to our view on some of this stuff, but our starting point on that is essentially that it hasn't had too much of an impact, of a large-scale impact on Queensland CLCs. We've delivered efficient and effective legal assistance services in this state for 40 years. That's done despite a lack of inadequate resources to meet the demands in our communities, and the NPA's impact in that space actually hasn't been that significant. We think we're doing some good stuff in collaborative service planning. The current funding arrangements speak to questions like how funding is allocated between states and territories, including the funding allocation model, and ask questions around some of the other ancillary issues is kind of underselling it, but things like the women's safety package, things like SAC supplementation and how that's been applied and worked. Performance monitoring and reporting, so the way that the state reports to the Commonwealth, but also how individual organisations are able to report to the state. And I think that speaks to questions of data definitions and data gathering. Fulfilment of agreed roles and responsibilities, particularly between the parties to the NPA, that is the Commonwealth and states and territories. With our view on that would be, despite having devolved decision-making to the states and territories, there's probably more of a leadership role that the Commonwealth should play in creating spaces for people to come together and have conversations about what good practice might be like and how we could learn from one another and support things like collaborative planning and data capture and those kinds of things, because our sense is that it's patchy across different states and territories. And then areas for improvement and opportunities to enhance current arrangements. As you'd expect, we've got a pretty long list of suggestions of ways that we think it might be improved. NACLAC is leading the national CLC response to this, as you'd expect. They've convened a working group of someone from each state and territory. Those people are also on an advisory group for URBIS to conduct the review, and so that group also comprises someone from the Legal Aid Commission in each state and territory and a couple of external experts, representatives from the Law Council, the New South Wales Law and Justice Foundation. And that group has been consulted pretty regularly as the review has been kind of planned and started. NACLAC's provided or articulated its position formally in a couple of ways, one through a preliminary submission that's available on their website, and one through a 2-page key messages document for the sector that Amanda Alford distributed to NPA funded centres last week. And of course, they're also able to speak directly to the reviewers, and I think that's meaning that the review plan and the review process is in pretty good nick. In terms of our preliminary position, our management committee adopted a list of positions in January or February, and we've distributed those to our members through digests and published them on our website. And then we made a preliminary submission 3 or 4 weeks before the discussion paper was released. We thought it was important both to provide our view from a state CLC peak association, recognising that that might be quite a different perspective to the views that individual centres might have. But we also thought that by nailing some of the things that we thought were live issues fairly early in the piece, we could help nudge the discussion paper to continue to consider some of the important issues. I think looking at the discussion paper, that's certainly been informed by the work of, by that submission, but also by the contribution of those CLC reps on the advisory committee. Can I might again just pause there and see if anyone has any questions, or if anyone wants to flag anything about any of that stuff. You can do that, a reminder, by typing a question into the questions box or pressing that button that looks like a hand on your control panel. All right. In terms of ways that we can get involved, as I said, I think my sense is that URBIS is pretty keen to get submissions. If individual CLCs are going to make submissions, I'd suggest responding to the questions in the discussion paper. It seems that they have a fairly technical process for tagging submissions, and so by linking back to the questions in the discussion paper, I think would be useful. I don't think it needs to be long at all, but I think some of the key messages that we would hit are CLCs are already doing a pretty good job in delivering services efficiently and effectively, despite inadequate resources to meet the needs of our communities, and the NPA hasn't made a huge impact on that. I think the reviewers would be interested to understand your perspective on collaborative service planning and the way that you work in partnership with others, whether that's through formal collaborative service planning processes or more likely through some of the relational work that you and your organisations have been doing for a long period of time. Some feedback on how you understand the data definitions in class and impacts that they've had on service delivery. I think they would be some of the useful points that individual CLCs could hit in that stuff. There are other ways that you can get involved. The reviewers are going to be visiting Queensland from the 20th till the 23rd of August. They're in Brisbane for a couple of days, and we're planning on hosting a roundtable for 2 or 3 hours with them on Tuesday the 21st. I'll send some information around about that. They'll then be in Townsville on the 22nd and Cairns on the 23rd. While they're in Brisbane on the 20th and 21st, that they'll be spending time with the Department of Justice and Attorney General, Legal Aid, us, QLAF, potentially other statewide services like ATSLs, although that's yet to be confirmed. We did suggest that they might want to meet with the Attorney General herself. I think I'm not sure that that'll pan out, in particular because Commonwealth staff of the Attorney General's Department, I don't think were particularly keen for that to happen, but we were pretty keen to demonstrate that we had an Attorney General here who understands some of the limitations of the NPA, particularly some of the challenges around the uncertainty and inadequacy of Commonwealth funding, but I don't think that'll pan out. There won't be many, if any, opportunities for one-on-one conversations with the reviewers while they're in Brisbane for individual CLCs, I suspect. Although the reviewers have suggested that they're open to phone conversations. The discussion paper, the review plan has a list of interview questions, and I'll circulate that to this group afterwards, and that might help you decide whether you'd like to have an individual conversation with them. If you do, get in touch and I'll try and tee something up. The other opportunity to catch up with the reviewers will be at the NACLAC conference. I'm pressing for Queensland CLCs that didn't get a chance to meet with the reviewers in Brisbane or Townsville or Cairns the week before to have a standalone session. I'm not sure where that will land. I think they can only be at the NACLAC conference for a couple of days. And there are a whole heap of competing priority groups there, but that's certainly my hope. There will be other ways that the centres will be able to engage with them at the NACLAC conference. I've got a question here. I talked about relational work before. I think when we're talking, and someone's asked if I could expand a little bit more on that. I think the National Partnership Agreement talks about collaborative service planning in a fairly formal way, and my sense is that community legal centres collaboration isn't always done in a formal planning sense, and that the types of relationships that you're building with other community organisations are important and demonstrate collaboration and demonstrate good practice. I don't think we should shy away from using those as examples of good collaboration and good outcomes for clients, even though it doesn't fit into a fairly prescriptive and formalistic approach to collaborative service planning under the National Partnership Agreement, or ways that QLAF or RLAF or other kinds of forums might have been structured to work. I hope that answers the question that's come through. Feel free to push me further on that, and I'd also invite other questions. So I've talked about kind of having a conversation with the reviewers, which can happen when they're in Queensland at the NACLAC conference or a phone consultation. The other way to get involved is to contribute to our submission. I said earlier that our preliminary submission was kind of our view in a kind of statewide, kind of peak-centred, I guess, analysis of how the National Partnership had been rolling. But I think, to be entirely clear, doesn't particularly represent the experiences of individual CLCs and how they've found the implementation of, how you have found the implementation of the NPA has affected your services, your organisations, your funding, your relationship with your funders, and so on. And we're very keen for our final submission to do that. Submissions close on the 28th of September, so we've got about 8 weeks to get that done. It would be our preference to get something out in the first or second week of September, I think, again, to kind of nudge the reviewers and provide a bit of leadership across the sector. I'd be pretty keen for that to happen, but to do that, we're really keen to get your views. On our website, we've set up a series of online pin boards for each of the 6 areas of exploration. And so you could provide any feedback that you've got on post-it notes on those electronic pin boards, that'd be great. Also hoping to organise a session at the NACLAC conference to get feedback from individual centres that can contribute to that work. In terms of the timeline, the review plan, as I said, submissions are due by the 28th of September. The site visits, or field visits as the consultants are calling them, happen in parallel to that. So they spend anywhere from 2 to 5 days in each state or territory between now and the end of September. We would expect to see a what they call a structural draft the week after submissions close and the week after those visits are finalised, which is part of the reason that we want our submission in a little bit earlier, and then a draft by kind of early to mid-November and a final report by the end of December. The consultants will be seeking advice from the advisory group at each of those stages as they're preparing the report. So I think we'll be able to provide some useful information then, along with our other colleagues from across the country. In terms of what happens after that, so the NPA review will be finalised in December. The current NPA expires in June 2020. We think there's a need for a funding commitment from both levels of government by May 2019. That will allow for a proper and thoughtful tender process or procurement process or whatever that might look like to run in the second half of 2019, so that there's no disruption to services should they need to should there be any particular changes there. If we didn't get a funding announcement in the 2019 budget, then that would mean that we probably wouldn't get a funding commitment until the 2020 budget in the first or second week of May at a Commonwealth level and the second week of June at a state level. That would be a matter of kind of 4 weeks before current funding arrangements end. We think that would be fairly catastrophic in terms of the disruption to services and the experience for clients, and that's why we're pushing so hard for a 2019 budget commitment. The NPA review ought feed into that, but so will working with you to ensure that both levels of government understand the importance of a 2019 budget bid. And this NPA review is an important component of that, but certainly not the only component of that. I think that's about all I have for you this afternoon. Pretty keen to get your sense of where it's at and what some of your priorities might be with it. We're still working out details in terms of the reviewer's visit in that week of the 20th of August, so I'm not sure how much extra information I can provide about how that might roll. Happy to take questions on notice there, and I'll also flick around a copy of these basic slides and a couple of resources after this webinar later today or early tomorrow. But I would be very keen to get your feedback, your thoughts and so on. So a reminder, you can toss stuff out in the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. Press that button that looks like a hand on the panel as well. Doesn't look like anyone's got any questions. It seems like everyone's all over National Partnership Agreement review and how it's going to roll and what we might need to say. That's not true. I've got a comment. All good so far. Thank you. Terrific. Well, ladies and gents, I might leave it there. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon, and I'll look forward to continuing this conversation as the NPA review progresses. Thanks very much. Have a good afternoon.